Hi everybody, Steven here. So this is part 2 of my vSAN series. We're actually going to start setting up vSAN in my environment. So if you want to learn how to do the setup, stick around. See you in a bit. Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around. So this is part 2 of my vSAN series. We're actually going to set up a vSAN cluster and get our data store all set up. My next video on this will probably be utilizing it and setting up the policies and stuff. So anyways, I'd like to point this out at this point. Thank you for subscribing. For those of you that have subscribed, for those of you who haven't subscribed, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing to the channel. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. It does help me out quite a bit. Also, I do have super thanks enabled if you want to support the channel that way. So enough of that. Let's jump into it. So let's go into my left screen over here. So I've logged into my vSAN environment. My vSphere environment. Now, there's a couple of ways we can set up vSAN. We could use this wizard, which came out, I think it was in 6.5 or 6.7 or something like that. I can't remember the version. It doesn't really matter. There's the wizard you could use to set it up, or you can manually set it up. I'm kind of used to manually setting it up, but I'll show you both. I'll set it up manually, and then afterwards I'll show you setting it up using the wizard, okay? So right now in my environment, if I click on data storage here, I have nothing. There's my data center, Site A data center. Under hosts and clusters here, you'll see I select my host. It says no data stores have been configured. That's probably why I got a warning on it. If I look at the hosts themselves, if I actually go into configure, storage devices, I actually have, I actually have a couple storage devices. I have a 20 gig disk. That's my boot disk. I have my 50 gig disk. Okay, that will be our cache tier. And I have two 100 gigs. That will be our capacity tier. Okay, each of my 3 servers have that similar setup. So we'll use a 50 gig disk for the cache, and we'll use two 100s for capacity. Now, in the real world, I understand VMware does a 10-to-1 type recommendation. Again, look those up. You want to make sure that you got the proper hardware and stuff like that, and supported hardware. In the lab environment, we don't really care. I'm in a nested environment. These are actually VMs. If you want to see, they're actually VMs running on VMware Workstation. I got host 1, 2, and 3. I got another machine running the vCenter server. So just to show you, I'm in a nested environment. Okay. So there's a couple, since I'm going to do this manually, there's a couple of steps I can do here. First of all, let's look at my networking. I've actually got my 3 hosts connected to a distributed switch, and I got a port group called management and a port group called vMotion, right? If I go to my host now, and if I go into configure VM kernel adapters, I've got a management. My VM kernel 0 is my management. That's on my port group management on the distributed switch. And my vMotion is on a VM kernel 1 is on a port group called vMotion on the distributed switch as well. Again, if you're not familiar with distributed switches, watch my networking video, okay? Now, my servers, each of my VMs here, I've got, when I look at it, I got 4 physical cards. These are all virtual, okay, folks? And all 4 of them are on the distributed switch. That kind of poses a problem, especially when it comes to the wizard, because it's going to say I can't create a distributed switch because there's no available cards. But I'll deal with that when we get to that part of my demo. But right now we're doing this manually. So I guess the first thing I need to do is create a port group for my vSAN. So let me go to my distributed switch. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to say distributed port group, new distributed port group, and I'm going to call it PG-vSAN. Okay, this will be my port group for my VM kernel port on vSAN. I'm going to go next. I'm just going to accept the defaults here. Now, notice over here in VLAN type, I've got none. In the real world, you'd probably be doing trunking. Maybe you've got vSAN traffic, vMotion traffic, whatever, going through these same NICs. You're probably going to be VLANing them all out using a trunk. I talk about that in my networking video as well. So you probably will have a VLAN. You'll probably be doing VLAN here. My lab environment, I don't care. I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to go next, and I'm going to go finish. I'm not doing trunking. So I created a port group called vSAN. Now, let me show you something here. Let's right click on my management port group, edit settings. In my management, if I go under NIC teaming, I got uplink 1, which is my first physical NIC, is the active. The standby will be the second physical NIC. Uplinks 3 and 4, I'm not using those. That's on management. My vMotion here, if I edit settings here, this is just my lab environment, teaming and failover. Uplink 2 is its active. Uplink 1 is its standby. Probably not a good idea for that. And uplinks 3 and 4 are not being used. I'm using uplink 3 and 4 for my vSAN. Technically speaking, it'd probably be better for me to use uplink 3 and 4 for my vMotion and my vSAN, right? I could do something like that. Use vSAN for uplink 3, use uplink 4 as its standby, that type of thing. But you know what? Hey, we're not talking about vMotion here. Let's go to vSAN. Let's right click. I'm going to go edit settings. Under teaming and failover, it's going to pick all the adapters for active. I'm just going to move all uplinks 1 and 2 down. And then I'm going to say my active uplink will be uplink 3. Oh, let me get rid of these. And then the standby will be uplink 4. So I can do something like that. So I'm just showing you, again, this is part of design. You're going to want to kind of think about this. There are some design guides on vSAN, and they do talk about that. Again, maybe you'll have different adapters, use a network I/O control and all that stuff, but it really depends on your environment. So I'm going to set up my port group for vSAN, and it's going to use those NICs. Great. Now I need to go in and manually create the VM kernel ports on my host for vSAN. Again, this takes a little bit longer than the wizard. So I'm going to go to host 1, configure VM kernel adapters. I'm going to go add networking. I'm going to say I'm creating a VM kernel adapter for vSAN. I'm going to use an existing network. There's my port group right here, port group vSAN. I'm going to use that. I'm going to click next. Now, the MTU size, so what do I want? Do I want to get it from the switch, or do I want to actually do a custom one? So maybe here I'll do whatever. In the real world, I would type in like 9,000, let's say. Best practice is, again, to have something like a large MTU, maximum transmission unit size. Again, that's how big your frames will go, right? In my environment here, I'm just going to stick with the small one, just because that's the way it is. If you're messing with MTU sizes, you got to make sure it's supported end to end. You don't want to be fragmenting. That will ruin your performance. Okay. This is my lab environment. I'm just going to leave it at the default here. Okay. In the real world, you're going to probably set it to a higher number. I'm going to enable the vSAN service on this. Okay. I'm going to go next. I'm going to give it an IP, right? So this is my VM kernel port 172.20.50.51. And the subnet mask 255.255.255.0. Now, do I want to override the default gateway? In other words, do I want it to use the same gateway as VM kernel 0, which is my management? The only time you really want to do this is if your vSAN network and your hosts are on different layer 2 networks. So I got some hosts vSAN network in one segment, some hosts vSAN network in another segment. Maybe you're doing stretch cluster or something. Then they need to have a default gateway so they can talk to each other. Mine is just one flat network, so I don't care. I can leave this alone. Okay? I'll leave my DNS. I don't care about that. I go next. It gives me a summary. I go finish. I now repeat the process on hosts 2 and 3, and I'm going to speed this up for you folks. There. Okay, so there, I've set it up. VM kernel 2 it comes up. That's my vSAN. It's on, great, it's on that port group, PG, vSAN 172.20.30.51, 172.20.30.52. It's on the port group vSAN. And 53. Great, we're ready to go. The next thing I need to do now is create my cluster. I don't have one. I'm going to right click, say new cluster, and I'm going to call it, well, whatever, cluster. I call it cluster-01. Call it something that makes sense. Now, I can enable DRS if I want to. Don't enable HA at this point. You need to configure vSAN first, because when you enable, because HA will use the vSAN network as its heartbeat. So you want to enable vSAN or HA after you enable vSAN, okay? So I'm going to enable vSAN. It will actually complain if you have it enabled. I'm going to enable vSAN. I am not using the extended storage architecture, which I talked about in my part 1. I'm not doing that. And this talks about Lifecycle Manager. I'm just going to not bother with the image here. I'm going to click Next. So I'm only enable vSAN. Gives me a summary. I go Finito, right? And then at this point, this is where the wizard is, okay? This is really cool, and I could use this if I want to. But if I hit skip quick start, if somebody hits that, you won't see that again. In fact, goodbye. you're not going to be able to use that anymore, right? To configure the cluster. There's no way to bring it back that I know of anyways. If somebody does, put it in the comments. So now we're doing this manually. Later I'll show you using the wizard, okay? So let me go in and now add these servers to the cluster, right? So let's drag and drop them into the cluster. There we go. And we got my recent tasks. It's updating vSAN configuration. Okay, we give it a few seconds here. It's chugging along. Again, I don't have the fastest lab in the environment. One of these days I will. I used to have IBM blade centers and chassis running in fiber channel in my home environment. That's when I was working at IBM. Even after that, so I had some pretty killer equipment back in the day, but obviously you don't really require that these days. Okay, just waiting for all that stuff to finish. Okay, I got a little red thing on there. That's okay. If I go to summary, what's it going to complain about? It says vSAN alarm, vSAN MTU, check, ping at large packets, okay? So it's complaining about the MTU I got set on it. Okay, whatever. And the cluster alarm, configuration consistency, right? So let's, so it's basically complaining about my MTU. I'm not too worried about this. This is my lab. You should really have a large MTU in production. If this was production, I'd be setting it to 9,000 bytes, making sure the physical environment can support that. I'm just going to reset all those. They talk about the vSAN build recommendations engines and the performance engines also status. I'm getting these alerts as well. Again, I'm in a virtual environment, so some of the stuff it's not going to like too much. Now, we haven't configured our data store. Look, actually come up with the vSAN data store. Interesting. Never mind, it's capacity 0. Okay, so let's go into configure. Let's scroll all the way down to the disk management under vSAN. By the way, I can go into, where are you? Licensing vSAN cluster, and I can assign a license. Right now I'm on eval mode. It's good till March 30th or March 24th, 2024. Okay, and it shows you the number of CPUs and cores. I'm in evaluation mode. Again, you would add your license here. That's one way to do it. I'm not going to worry about that. You would do that in production. I'm going to go into disk management. And under here, it says claim unused disks. There's 9 disks. Remember, I got 3 servers. Each server has a 50 gig and 2 100 gig disks, right? So 3 disks each, 9. So I could go in and claim them. Again, notice over here the health on everything is good. So I'm going to say claim unused disks. Now at that point here, no, it says no disk is selected. That's correct. I haven't selected anything. Notice my view here. Group by disk model and size. So it's showing me all my disks based on the model and the size. So it's showing me, oh, I got some 100 gig disk. I got some 50 gig disk. If I expand this, it says, okay, here's my hundreds, and it's showing me the servers that they're on over here. And again, here, if I expand the 50 gigs, it's showing me the servers that they're on. Now, let's just, maybe I don't want to look at that view. Maybe I don't like that view. I want to go into maybe hosts. So now I'll see each host individually, and I'll see there's a 50 gig disk here on host 2, and a 100 gig disk on host 2, another 100 gig disk here. Here's host 3. It's got a 50. Again, you could view whatever you're comfortable with, right? Since I'm starting off this brand new and all the hosts have all the same disk and the same size, this disk view is probably the easiest one, but whatever works for you. Now notice it's coming up and says this hard drive, this is a physical, sorry, this is a mechanical disk. That's why it says HDD. So it thinks it's a spindle disk. I can say, now normally in a real world it would pick up the physical and it should know if it's flash or not. If it doesn't, you can go and change it. So I can say mark it as flash. I know it's a flash disk. Over here I'll say mark it as flash, right? Let's just expand it, make sure everything's been, oh, these ones didn't mark. Let's mark it as flash, mark it as flash. Don't know why. I should have marked them all. Probably because I was bouncing back and forth between the views. So they're all marked as flash. Yeah, there we go. And they're all marked as flash. Great. So you shouldn't really have to do that in a physical environment because it should detect the proper disk, but it doesn't. You have this as an option. Now claim 4, again, here's my 50 gig disk down here. I'm going to say use this as cached here. Great. Okay. So you see up here, it's showing me my cache. And then for my 100 gig disk, I'm going to say use this as capacity tier. Great. All right. And again, I could have just picked and choose one disk at a time, but I just said I'm going to pick them all. And I'm going to say create. So at this point here now, it's actually going to create that disk group. It's got to format the system. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to do this. So I shall probably speed this up a little bit. Okay. By the way, if you notice, it's deploying an OVF template, and it's deploying a VCLS virtual machine, a vSphere cluster services virtual machine. This VM here is actually, again, if you watch my DRS and HA videos, if you haven't watched those, these are VMs, service VMs for those clusters. That's kind of, so you'll see these deploy. I'm just going to let this continue on, okay? Probably take about a minute or two, but I'll speed it up again. Okay, so we have our vSAN data store. I could actually use this to create a VM if I want to. Let me just right click on my cluster, say new VM. I'm just going to do this real fast, say new virtual machine. I don't care what it's called. And then my cluster doesn't have DRS, so I'll have to pick a host. And then now I'm going to pick the vSAN data store. The default data store, I can say I want to pick the storage policy, the vSAN's default storage policy, which is failure to tolerate equals 1. I'll talk more about policies and stuff in another video, okay? And I'll click next, whatever, next, guest OS, I don't care, customize hardware, I don't care, and then finish. And at that point, there's my VM there, great name on my VM. If I click on this in data store, you'll see it's on the vSAN data store, okay? So I could power it on, install an operating system, just like I could do vMotion and all that wonderful stuff. So I could use this as a regular data store. So that's it. The next video, so that was doing it manually. The next video is I'll reset my environment. The next video we'll do it using the wizard, which it makes things a little bit easier. So see you all in a bit. Actually, before we jump into that next one, that next half, I just want to show you some of the settings here. I'm not going to go through everything because I'll probably do separate videos on it. But since we're configuring the vSAN cluster right now, I think it's kind of important. I'm going to select my cluster. I'm going to go into configure. I'm going to scroll all the way down to vSAN and then services. From there, you'll see there's a lot of stuff that you can do. Talks about service, talks about remote data stores. I'll probably talk about that later in some other video. Performance services, file service, and network. You can, if your cards support remote direct memory access, you can turn them on. Mine won't let me do it because it doesn't support it. This can improve your performance. So there's various settings like that. If you want to set up your vSAN storage or data store as a iSCSI target, I might do a video on that, but anyways, we'll leave all that alone. What I want to show you is this data services, because you'll see this in the next half, right? If I click on edit here, so I've got my cluster set up, but now I can actually go in and do stuff like encryption. Do I want to encrypt a virtual machine? Again, you'll need some kind of key provider for this. Do you want also to encrypt your data in transit, right? In other words, that's the data going across the vSAN network. Do you want to have that encrypted, right? So there's options here for encryption. I'm not going to do it. But the dedupe and compression, this sounds pretty good. When you select compression or dedupe, notice here when I select this, I get this, first of all, disk format options, allow reduced redundancy. Notice it won't let me select that. If I select compression or dedupe and compression, it allows me to select this. What this is going to do, it's going to basically do a rolling format of your vSAN data store. So right now I got no VMs on there, and if if I'm going to do this, that's great. It's going to do a rolling format on that. If I had a bunch of VMs, let's say I set up my cluster and 6 months from now I want to enable compression or dedupe and compression, at that point it needs to move all. It's got to format all the drives, right, and all the disk groups. So it needs to move the data around, and maybe you don't have enough space to move it all, and that's where this allow reduced redundancy. That means I'll allow my VMs to not be protected. This is very dangerous, okay? So just make sure, oh, I'm going to select this and not think about the possible problems. If while it's doing this rolling format, something fails, you could lose VMs. So I wouldn't select this unless you absolutely have no choice. This is where it comes into planning. If you plan on doing compression or deduping compression, know when you're going to configure the cluster. Yeah, I think we're going to do this 6 months from now. Then do it now. Set it up. There's a couple of other things too you got to be aware of, like selecting compression and then going to encrypt my VMs. It doesn't really make sense at that point because you're not really going to, sorry, maybe not, doing dedupe and encrypting your VMs. You're not going to get any benefit from that, right? Also, one of the downsides about selecting dedupe, and I actually wasn't aware of this till a little bit later, but when you select dedupe, let's say you got a disk group, like in my lab environment, I got a disk group. I got one cache disk and I got two 100 gig disks inside my disk group, and that's on each server. If one of the 100 gig disks dies, right, no problems. I'm still redundant, everything works fine, right? If I select dedupe, if a disk inside a disk group fails, that whole disk group is marked bad, okay? So that's kind of like a, ouch, okay? So you may have other disks. If you got 7 disks in a disk group and one of the 7 fails, the other 6 are okay. Those other 6 can be brought offline, right? So this is something you may want to really sit down and consider. Compression will compress your, if it can, I think it's 4K blocks, don't quote me on that, but if you can get a 50% compression, it will compress the data. If not, it just writes it. Dedupe and compression, again, dedupe, I just kind of talked about some of the downsides about that. All this occurs after the cache. So technically speaking, by turning these on, you shouldn't really notice a performance hit. Notice I'm saying shouldn't. Because it hits your cache drive, then when writes come in to that server, it hits the cache drive, then the acknowledgement is sent back to the application. The cache drive then writes it out to the capacity tier. So the cache tier gets it, then it writes it to the capacity tier, and at that point, it does the dedupe and compression. So that's the part where it's going to take time. It will. It's requiring CPU cycles, obviously, right? But technically, from a write perspective, you shouldn't really notice a performance impact. So really watch out for this dedupe and compression. You may want to really think about that. The dedupe obviously is for space saving. You may be able to get better space saving using like RAID 5 or RAID 6 or something like that instead of like mirroring. By the way, I'm just going to mention this right now. It was brought to my attention on the previous video. I said you need 4 hosts for RAID 5. That's in the OSA, the original storage architecture. In the extended storage architecture, ESA, that's the new one in vSAN 8. That's where you don't need the cache tier. The RAID 5 now, you can actually do it with a minimum of 3 hosts. There's a whole little difference on how it's doing it. It's actually pretty cool. I'll do a video on that. But I just wanted to mention it was one of my subscribers. I'm sorry I didn't have the name right now, but thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. So I just wanted to show you those settings here that you can change on the cluster. There's also object repair timer. I'll probably do videos on all this kind of stuff as well. But I just wanted to point this one out. Since you're creating the cluster, if you plan on doing compression, do it now before you start putting VMs on there instead of after the fact, because it's going to take a while and you're going to get a performance hit. So probably not a good idea to do it like 9 o'clock Monday morning when there's VMs on it. Everybody's access it. Anyways, enough of that. Let's continue on to the next half, which talks about setting this up using the wizard. Okay? And we'll see the difference there. Thanks a lot. Hi everybody, we're back. So I reset everything. You see I got no data store over here. If I go to the data store, you'll see there's nothing there. What I did change is before I had my distributed switch, and I have 4 NICs from each server assigned to the distributed switch. I know I noticed the cluster wizard doesn't. It tries to create a distributed switch for you for the vSAN, or I could use an existing. But I'm going to show you creating one. So it doesn't like it, obviously, if I don't have any available NICs. So what I've done is I went to my distributed switch and I removed those NICs from it. So using a wizard, I'm going to create a distributed switch to show you how easy it is. Let me just show you. Go to host 1 here. If I go to configure physical adapters, See VMNIC 0 and VMNIC 1. They're on that distributed switch, my first distributed, and VMNIC 2 and 3, they're assigned to nothing. So let's go ahead and do this. By the way, if you're wondering this error, it was downloading patches and I just canceled it. I'm going to right click. I'm going to right click on my data center. I'm going to say new cluster, and we're going to say it's, come on. We're going to say it is cluster -01. Again, call it something that makes sense. I spelled cluster wrong. 01. Again, as I mentioned before, you can enable DRS if you want to, but HA you wait till after vSAN is done, okay? Because HA will use the vSAN network for its heartbeat. I'm going to enable vSAN. I'm going to enable, I'm not going to use extended storage architecture or ESA. I'm not going to worry about lifecycle manager here. So I'm going to click next. I'm going to go finish. So it just created that cluster. All right, so let me get rid of this out of the way here. So now we could use the wizard, the quick start wizard. So I could add hosts. Let's do that. So I'm going to click on add hosts. And this is the cool part. I can sit here and add in each of the hosts. I'll make a list, keep, long, whatever. I got 20, I could type them all in here if I want to, and then hit next, which is kind of nice. Or I can do this, existing host, which I got my 3 there. I'm going to pick them all. I'm going to go next. And it gives me a little summary on the host. And I go next, and then I go finish. And at that point, you'll see it's doing a few little things, updating the vSAN configuration. We see the little spinny wheel over here. So I'm going to wait for that to finish, all right? So I will probably speed this up. Okay, we're back. It's done. So let me minimize this. You see it came up with a little warning here. SCSI controllers is VMware. What that's telling, it's not certified. It should say not certified. But if I click on this, let's click on it and see what happens, right? It comes up. It gives me a list of controllers and stuff like that. It's telling me there's a problem with this controller that's not certified. It's because I'm in a hosted environment. I'm in a nested environment. My ESXi hosts are VMs, okay? If this was a production environment and I saw this, I'd be concerned, okay? I'd say, oh, we're not using certified hardware. We may have an issue here, right? So I would probably hit the brakes on that or see what's going on. Anyways, let's continue on. So let's go to configure the cluster. I'll go configure. Now I can say configure networking later. Maybe we're not doing vSAN, so I don't need to do any of that stuff, right? But this can allow us to do vSAN, right? So I'm going to do my networking right now, and I'm going to create a distributed switch, number of distributed switches, 1. I'm going to create one. I'm going to call it VDS-vSAN, okay? And it's going to have 1 port group. Now notice when I clicked over here, it updated over here. It said the vSAN network. So this is going to create the vSAN network for me. And it's going to use the distributed switch, which I'm creating right here. I could, from the drop down. Then over here, it's creating the port group. That's what that is. But I don't like that name. I don't like that port group. VDS, vSAN. I'm going to call it PG-vSAN. Whatever you want to call it. Make sure you got vSAN in there so it makes sense. If I scroll down, now it's asking me my physical adapters. It's creating the distributed switch for my vSAN environment. So I'm going to say, now this is the part you want to make sure you pick the right adapters. Don't go, well, I'm not quite sure. It could, especially if you pick adapter 0, it could cause an outage on that host. A brief outage maybe, but you got to be sure. So I know it's my 2nd adapter and my 3rd adapter I want for this. So I'm going to assign it to them. Great. So I'm going to go next. Now at this point here, you'd probably put in, you're more than likely going to have VLAN set up in your environment, a VLAN for vMotion, a VLAN for management, a VLAN for production, or VM traffic, a VLAN for vSAN, right? In my lab environment, I don't care. Okay, I'm not using that. Now, this is where it's asking me, do I want to set up the IP addresses for the VM kernel port for vSAN, okay? And yes, I do. I'm going to do my static addresses. I'm not going to use DHCP. And I'm going to type in my IPs. So this will be for the first server, 172.20.30.51, subnet mask 255.255.5.0. And again, as I mentioned before in the previous one, when we did it manually, I would specify my gateway. If I had hosts on different vSAN networks that need to talk to each other, maybe I'm doing a stretch cluster. In my lab environment, all the hosts are on the same flat vSAN network. I don't need to worry about a gateway. Now, if I had 20 hosts here, I would just manually type them all in. Or watch this. I'm going to hit autofill. It will take the IP address that I have here. It'll match the subnet mask, take the IP address, and I'll just add 1 to it. Look at that. Boom. Okay, so that's kind of neat. I'm going to click next. Now at this point here, it's talking about, since we're setting up a cluster, this is a cluster wizard. It's asking me about vSAN options. It's asking me about host options. I don't care about lockdown mode and all that stuff. It's asking me about enhanced vMotion compatibility. Again, I don't care about that in this video. But let's talk about vSAN options. I'll go through these more in detail later on in policies and stuff like that. But again, deployment mode, this is a single site cluster or a stretch cluster. Do I want data at rest encryption? Do I want data encryption during transit? All these things you can turn on. Again, these are things you would seriously consider in production, especially the encryption and stuff. For my lab environment, I don't really care about it. Do you want to use space efficiency technology? I'll do a video on this. Compression, dedupe and compression, that type of thing. Fault domains, remote direct memory access support. These are network cards. If we've got that, I don't have any. Auto policy management. I think that's all part of the extended storage architecture, right? Again, I don't care about this. And again, this stuff can kind of be changed afterwards. So I'll leave that for now. I'm going to go next. Now it's asking me the claim. You've seen this when I did it manually, right? So I'm not going to go through and explain this all again. But if I open this up, you'll see it found my 100 gig disks. And again, it says it's a spindle type disk. I'm going to say, no, it's a flash. Same thing with my 50. They're flash. And I'm going to say my 50 gigs are going to be used for cache. And my hundreds are going to be used for capacity, right? I'm just going to open this up and make sure it's selected and everything. Yeah, it looks good. Looks good. Actually, I don't even have to do that. You'll see my vSAN capacity 600 gig here, and the cache is 150 gig. Looks good to me, folks. I'm going to click next, right? And at that point, it gives me a summary. I click finish, and you see the spinny wheel over here. Now I'm going to open this up, and it's preparing the vSAN. Now notice the spinny wheel over here on the right, in the middle of the right. I'm not going to click on stuff. I'm not going to do all this crazy. I'm just going to go take a break. All right. So that's what I suggest when you get to this point. Just leave it alone. It's basically creating disk groups, formatting disks, all that kind of wonderful stuff. It's creating VM kernel ports, all these wonderful things. So I'm just going to leave it alone. I'll probably speed this up for you, but we'll be right back. Okay, we are back. You see it's finished. It's come up with some potential issues here. Remember, because I'm running in a virtualized environment. All right, so you can click on these and it brings you to links there to look at this. Look at the vSAN build recommendations. Comes back. I'll talk about Skyline Health probably in another video, but it's telling me the SCSI controller. It's not displays information about the storage. Anyways, it's vSAN build. vSAN relies on So this controller is giving me. It's saying, hey, you don't get a certified controller, and because of that, it's triggering this recommendation for build. In other words, you should build a proper cluster type of thing. Again, I'm in a virtual environment. Who cares, right? Let's go to my data store. You see I got a vSAN data store, right? Just like before, 600 gig right over there. Great. Okay. So that's pretty much it. That's, and we can utilize this vSAN data store just like I showed you before. So which method do you want to use, manual or use the wizard? The wizard makes things a lot easier, but if you rely too much on the wizard and you go somewhere and they disabled the wizard, then knowing how to do it manually is probably a good thing. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it entertaining, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. My next video on this, I'll talk about policies and all that stuff and storage policies, and we'll play a little bit about that. Actually, before I even do that, I won't even, maybe we will, okay? I'll figure it out, okay? Maybe we'll add more hosts. Leave a comment down below. I'm going to add more storage, add more hosts, and then maybe play with VMs and storage policies, okay? Anyways, that's it. Thanks a lot. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye now.